Let me see, on this opening slide, I love this report to the Botswana government from 1983 by Louise Fortman, a environmental sociologist at Berkeley now. But that summarizes everything. That's her point of the beautiful study of what's wrong with the rural development in 1983, which the government of Botswana may have taken into account in their successful development thereafter. But she says the major problem she sees in rural development is that responding to poor villagers in remote communities is at the bottom of everyone's priorities for the simple reason that no one is accountable to villagers, and that's what I'm trying to model here. This is a great conference with many people I admire and many of my friends, and as people who know me well, you know I've been obsessed lately with subnational government. So let me at least say something about this. This paper is part of that, and I think the one key idea, the first line there, that national leaders have other things being equal, have a vested interest in centralizing power. So decentralization may be underapplied, undersupplied in many nations. There's a reason to think that, well, we have to figure out why. The bullet points there are several different logically separate reasons why decentralization might be, quote, good for the interests of most people in countries most of the time. My QJPS 2006 paper was arguing that although local government may be more corrupt than national government, our national governments are less corrupt when we have autonomous subnational governments, because those who do a good job in subnational governments then become strong competitive candidates for national office. I've argued in going to ungoverned spaces that decentralization is good for state building, in that it for counterinsurgency, because it guarantees that every community has some locally empowered people who are also locally popular. If it's decentralized democracy, who have some local popular support in every community, will have some political stake in the system, because we're guaranteeing to devolve power. That's a second logically separate reason why counterinsurgents should want to know about decentralization. And of course, when we support a foreign country, a regime in a foreign country, we give its national leaders less reason to decentralize, because if they can count on the U.S. Army to enforce their authority in remote provinces, why do they need to make deals with local elites in remote provinces? But today I want to talk about the effect of decentralization for economic growth, and I want to argue that efficient local public investment requires local accountability, and that's what the model is. So I'm going to give you a model of moral hazard in local public services, which has an efficient solution that's feasible only when officials are accountable to local voters. Let me just say, giving personal things on introductions, I want to say, Phil Rainey and I have a very technical paper. I mentioned this. I want to mention this for just a second, because I don't know if I'll make. People think they have simple models that turn out to be very confusing to the audience, and this may be one of them also. I may not make it sound complicated, but it's really a trivial model. There's nothing technically interesting. I've got another paper that's technically complicated that's not necessarily about anything, but I wanted to emphasize, no, my point is that this is a costly signal. I want to say this model, in case you miss it, there's nothing impressive about it. Well, then why the hell am I doing it? The answer is because I think this is such an important problem. The understanding that there's a local agency problem. What's the title of this paper? Local agency costs of political centralization. That when you get together a bunch of people in the capital to try to rewrite, look at the French Revolution. If you get a bunch of people in the capital to say, it's a brand new day, let's write a totally new modern government for our country, they're comfortable with the institutions of power in the capital, and they're going to tend to centralize. And why should they share power with unknown groups in the provinces? So, but that there are agency problems that are absolutely fundamental to economic growth, I believe, that arise, and we need models to emphasize them. Lots of people have argued this. I wish I discussed this with Eleanor Ostrom, but it took me a while to realize that when she was alive, that what I was coming to think about was what she'd been doing for a long time. But I really want to emphasize just the Martinez, Bravo, Patrick, Miguel, Chian, and Yao paper. That's the empirical paper that is, in some sense, what they find is that when the People's Republic of China in the 1980s, different years and different places, allowed villagers to start electing their own local government heads, or essentially made local government heads responsible to a majority of the local villagers. Local public spending went up enormously in these places, and it was not public spending financed by the central government. The villagers were willing to cooperate with new user fees and other special taxes, but. And I want to honor Daniel Treisman's book that is taking the other. I like to use the adjective starry-eyed to refer to people like me who we could be accused of starry-eyed when we talk about federalism, federal decentralization. What a good thing! And Daniel Treisman has this good, it's empirical and theoretical. His book, what's it called, Architecture of Government, that says, those people are just they're enthusiastic, but their arguments don't hold water. I think if you look, my 2008 QJPS 2006 paper is referred to in his, and I think his paragraph there doesn't attacking my argument, which is, it's an honor to be in there. I think, and I told Daniel this, I think if he reads this, he'll find his argument isn't really very valid. But the other ones, he argues, for example, that arguments for regional that federalism helps to supply, meet different tastes in different regions, or provide policy experimentation, that actually a unitary central state could do that. So the model, let me just describe in words the model. The next slide will have the core basic model. When the quality of local public services can be observed only by local residents, then the responsible officials cannot be held accountable for this quality unless the local residents have some effective power over these officials' careers. We're going to set up a model where the information about whether the local officials are doing a good job or not is available only to the local residents. So I guess we're not talking about things like when a local official is maintaining order and preventing violent uprisings, that can be seen by people outside the community. When the official is maintaining roads that everybody that are for national use, the big part of the national road network. People from other parts of the country can drive over those roads, but protection of property rights, local transportation networks that are only available for the local only used by local residents, or protection of property rights or contract enforcement for transactions and property of local residents. That looks like you can't, if you're not in the remote town, you don't know. Then essentially those people have the information. Their information must be determining whether the official gets his long-term moral hazard rents or not. Political decentralization, now I'm going to assume that you don't need to politically decentralize to get that information. The central government, the ruler of a centralized unitary state is even the ruler of a centralized autocracy, which is what I'll consider first and longest. Can send spies or informants out to send them back reports about, well, what do the local residents think about my appointed mayors and governors? You can get that information, but do you really want to use it when the autocrat in the autocratic ruler of the country? So political decentralization means creating a constitutional guarantee that local residents can dismiss local government officials when they want, when local residents get the information that says that these officials should be dismissed, that they really will be dismissed. That constitutionally guaranteeing that the local residents can bring their information to bear on destroying a local official's career. Without such guarantees, the local officials' careers may depend more on national political relationships than on local public services. Without such guarantees, there's moral hazard at the center. The problem is, will the ruler actually use the information that his spies sent back that the local people are a little bit unhappy with their governor, or will he ignore it? Because he's a big shot. He's the king of the country. He can do whatever he wants. Failure to ensure, and then I'll set up the model so that failure to ensure good public services deters private investments and becomes a big, makes the country very poor. So here in one screen is a simple technical model that just does that. Let's see. So consider a remote town with n residents. So all the parameters are introduced on this page. Let's see. There are n residents, and that's going to be fixed. So it does in the town. Each resident first has to decide whether to make some large investment K to start an enterprise, and the whole point of that is that if we don't have good government, people simply won't invest, and then the whole town will be impoverished. Then, once they've made the investment, then each year the resident's enterprise can return either S, a success, or 0. The probability of success, pi of G, depends on the level of local public spending, G. I'm going to measure local public spending in per capita units. So NG is the local public services in the is the amount effectively spent on local public services in the town. If you wanted it, I'll use, anyway, it doesn't matter whether it's measured per capita or not, because n is going to be a constant, I think. Anyway, this pi function, the probability of success for each resident is increasing, concave, differentiable, of course, between 0 and 1. Everybody's risk neutral in this little model. Everybody discounts the future at some discount factor beta, and that's it. But the most important thing to add to that is this, to say that the budget for local public services has to be managed by one local official, and or a unified team that can act as a group of local government officials. Anyway, so the local official can divert any part of the budget to personal consumption and can even flee abroad with it and be immune to prosecution. So therefore, their moral hazard rents, every year, if we're going to have a budget of G, of NG, that the official could steal and run abroad with, then we're going to have to, the official will prefer to retain office with an annual salary of NR forever, rather than flee abroad with 1 year's budget, if and only if NR over 1 minus beta is greater than NG. And so that tells us that the annual salary has to be G times 1 minus beta, and if beta is close to 1, then that's a modest amount. We pay that per resident per year, and then if that's necessary, and the question is it sufficient? And the answer is it's all, yeah. We will. The next slide will say, oh yes, of course, if n is a large number, we can design a mechanism that will keep the moral hazard rents down to this. But R of G is the moral hazard rents in per resident per year that have to be paid to the official in order to give the official the appropriate incentive to spend. So to spend the local public goods, the local public budget appropriately. So we're setting this up so that public office is valuable, but the only evidence of the official's actual spending is the binomial random number of successes. The binomial random variables have to have 2 parameters: n, the number of trials. There are n people. We assume all n of them will invest in. We hope that all n of them will invest in their enterprise, and the probability of success in each enterprise is pi of G. And so, what is this? This is meant to be setting up a model where you really have to poll the community. If you only ask one person, did he have a success or not, you don't have as good a signal as if you ask 1,000. And if it's a town of 10,000 people, 10,000 independent draws, that's going to have a pretty small standard deviation. So it's going to be a pretty good signal. So even with a few tens of thousands of people, within the logic of this model, we probably have pretty good. If we poll the whole community democratically, have something that looks like a lot like an election, then we have enough information to evaluate the hidden G. And so this page is meant to go through that there is an optimal solution with local accountability, and there's a formal proposition. That's okay. So it looks like I'm being careful about technical things, and I think I got the proof right. But and it's hard to read because it's technical. But let's see what the resident's budget. So the resident's annual U of G is the resident's annual benefit, and that's pi of G times S. That's at the beginning of the year. The resident's expected returns from the project when G is spent is the per capita public spending. Minus 1 minus beta K, that's the That's the annualized amortization of the original annual amortization of the original investment that we're counting as a cost per year. G, of course, is the public spending that I'm assuming is going to be paid by taxes by the community. But then in addition to G, the R of G, the moral hazard rents, which are going to be 1 minus beta times G, that also has to be paid. That's not the public investment. That's the salary. At the end of the year, if we vote to renew the official, then if the official is popular enough, then we will renew the official and pay the official. We'll pay her R of G. So there's some G1 that maximizes it, and to avoid a trivial solution, I certainly want to assume that that U of G1, G sub 1 stands for the maximizes benefit per resident, and I certainly want to assume that U of G1 is strictly positive, and that's what the third line inequality says. And so it's a simple plan. Let's say it says the official gets some budget B, and picks a per capita spending G that's between 0 and B. Whatever, if it's less than B, that means that the official is going to steal some of the budget. Then, if there's some fraction of residents who have to report that they had successes, that they like the official this year, and if the fraction, we're going to ask all the residents, well, did you have a good year? Do you like the official? Should we renew the official? If more than theta of them, fraction of them say yes, then we pay the official some amount rho, and renew it and retain her in office. Otherwise, we pay her nothing. Anyway, let's see. The Q function is the probability of passing success. That's just a binomial probability. So what does it say? It basically says that let's just see what the moral the officials is going to choose a level of how much to steal, G bar, and such that the probability of passing the test and then going on to getting rho paid this year and beta and then continuing the value should be the maximum overall possible G's of, as I steal more of it, I get more benefits now, but I have a lower probability of being paid and renewed. But the answer is let's see, this says pick any tiny epsilon, if n is large enough, there's a limit as n goes to infinity, so if n is large enough, you can find renewal thresholds, salaries, and a budget, so that, let's see, what does it say? The most important thing is the salary is just going to be a little bit. It's going to be less than. It's going to be within epsilon of the efficient salary. The budget is just going to give the official the amount of money we want her to spend, but she might steal some of it. But in the limit, she's going to spend. And is large enough, she's going to be spending essentially all of it. And she'll be spending it in such a way that she's going to pass the threshold. The threshold is going to be just low enough that she's going to pass with probability 1. And you know how to do it. That just says we choose to set the threshold 1 over root n is larger than the standard deviation of the binomial random variable, and that log n just says many standard deviations below is really only a tiny fraction, a tiny probability difference, and that's enough. Anyway, I'll just stop there. There's a lot of things to say that I should skip in a short talk, and that's what this slide is about. One was theta is not necessarily a majority, but using the idea that the expected long side could randomly abstain, as in Feddersen and Pessendorfer, the theta could, without loss of generality, be made in practice a half, to call it majority vote. Another thing I want to at least mention is that if there's a political instability parameter that's discussed here that if we suddenly didn't trust, this is important, if we suddenly expected, there's a distrustful equilibrium where the voters expect the incumbent official to steal all the money and therefore they don't want to renew her, and therefore if she is renewed and given a large budget to spend, this is her last time, she might as well just steal it and run away. So there's a distrustful equilibrium, and political instability is modeled by some probability Q that the voters might suddenly distrust, turn against their official, and therefore have to replace her. Because of some sort of scandal or embarrassment that makes it common knowledge that the voters and the official can't trust each other anymore, because this is a relationship of trust. We're going to give you lots of money to spend on our local public goods, and it's on the condition that you think that if you spend it correctly, we will vouch for you to continue in your privileged position. and we'll have to pay you more if there's a chance that for exogenous reasons we might cease to distrust you. So political instability is bad, but an ideal, so what have we done? We've set up, this is a simple model in which an ideal form of local government has a good equilibrium that essentially, when n is large enough, essentially clearly achieves the first best, and is very close to the first best for large n, and therefore the problem is solved. There's an incentive constraint because we have to siphon off a certain amount of resources to keep the agent, the local public agent, happy. That is an excess cost of government, but subject to that incentive constraint, we are efficient with local politics. Now the question is, can a national ruler in a centralized regime imitate that? And the answer is maybe yes, maybe no. And what I want to do is go through two models. First, and this will take most of the time. I guess most of the time is a centralized autocratic regime, and then I'd like to have at least 4 or 5 minutes on which I think on a centralized democratic regime. But first, let me do the centralized autocratic regime. The paper I hope makes it clear that the simple model of a national autocratic regime is ridiculous, but is ridiculously simple as any paper's model has to be. But go read Milan Svolik's book, and I say that gives you the right way. This is just an approximation to that. Okay. So let's say, suppose an autocratic regime has power over national government. The first thing to say is, of course, that in a Chicago Coasian sense, it would be. Efficiency requires us to have the local public goods, because if the national ruler, if the national ruler could commit, to decentralize, I'm the ruler of this island, but I can issue a charter that will create a town government, and thereafter you will have the local politics that's completely autonomous, that was described in the previous few slides. And if people there would focus on the good equilibrium, then if the people of the town would pay me a tax to the national treasury, an annual tax of U of G per person, then they'd be, of U of G1 per person, then of anything less than U of G1 per person, then they would be better off from that transaction, and I, the ruler, would be better off. So it really is inefficient for the benefits U of G to be allowed to be not realized. But actually, the ruler can do even better, because the moral hazard rents, so far for the residents, were being in our calculation of U of G1, were being treated as a what was U of G1? That's up in the top right corner there. It was subtracting off the salary you have to pay to the agent, but the agent is happy about the local government also. So if the ruler appoints supposing the ruler not only gives a charter, but also appoints the first mayor of the town, and says, goes to one of his supporters and says, you give me political services that are worth NG, which is then you'll be, and then in exchange, I'll appoint you the first mayor of the town. And then you will get those moral hazard rents from this new autonomous town. Then the ruler is actually benefiting on an annualized per capita basis, but U of G plus R of G. And notice, by the way, the argmax of that, the optimizing level of public spending, was actually even higher. So the ruler really wants to centralize the moral hazard rents. There's a problem here, and that is, however, the ruler would like to be able to sell the office, to not just sell the rights of the town to create its municipal government benefit, but the ruler would also like to be able to sell the right to be the mayor of this town. However, the mayor must be accountable to the residents of the town, because if the mayor is simply appointed and gets the budget every year and isn't accountable to them, since nobody but they know whether he actually spends it, and he'd prefer not to spend it, but to spend it on his own consumption rather than spend it on public goods, then he or she, the agent, won't provide the benefits, and then the residents do not want to pay the U of G taxes. Maybe they want to hide in the hills rather than come and live in the town. So what I want to argue here is that the ruler really wants to centralize power over local officials. And so I want to, let me say, if the ruler creates the town, appoints the first mayor, but then says, I'm really out of it, and there's some, what does it mean to say there's a constitutional constraint? It means that, essentially, to me it means that, that if the ruler ever interfered with the town's ability to sack one of his appointed mayors, or somehow rescued the mayor and paid the mayor, gave the mayor some other beneficial office after being chased out of town, if the ruler interfered with their ability to punish the mayor, then the ruler, nobody should ever trust the ruler ever again. The ruler has violated a fundamental constitutional constraint. Then it's not a centralized autocracy anymore. It's decentralized. They've decentralized power to the townspeople. So I'm talking about kind of centralized autocracy that doesn't make a constitutional constraint. Now, the plan I described above, would require the ruler to make a credible commitment to a constitutional division of power which would be against his interests ex post. With local accountability, if the ruler uses local offices as rewards, the actual reward, remember, the rewards have to be taken slowly. When you're appointed mayor of a town, you expect the value worth one annual budget of the whole town, because that's what you could have stolen, but you're not supposed to take it in 1 year. If you do, then the whole thing hasn't worked. It only works when you accept that you're going to be paid over a long period of time. And that's the only way that we get the local public spending, is that the appointed mayors take their rewards slowly. But now they're vulnerable to what happens if the local residents, he does a good job, the local official does a good job, but the local residents say he didn't. Why would they do that? Possibly because some opponent of the king who wants to make trouble starts stirring up distrust. So the local rulers, I want to argue this, I'll say this again on the next slide, that any ruler, this is my American Political Science Review 2008 paper, any political leader needs a reputation for reliably rewarding supporters. But with local accountability, if the ruler uses local offices as rewards, then the value of those rewards depend on the voters honestly expressing their approval when the official does a good job. They become vulnerable to political, local politics creating distrust of his officials, and suddenly his reputation for reliably rewarding his supporters is vulnerable to other people, and that's something that rulers don't want. Worse than that, a second point is, and this will come up on the democratic side, that with political autonomy, successful local leaders can begin to develop reputations for public service and for patronage, because it isn't really being done by one person. The local official probably has to promise moral hazard rents to subagents. So he's building up the local appointed official is building up a reputation for public service and patronage, which is just what it takes to become a serious competitor for national leadership. So that's dangerous. Local public, this is my QJPS 2006 theme, that local governments make national politics more competitive, but we're talking about a national ruler. The national ruler doesn't want local government leaders proving how good they would be as alternative national leaders. So a fiscally beneficial decentralization of power may be politically too costly for an incumbent national leader. That's the fundamental problem. So now let's say what's going on at the national level. The title of this slide, Separation of Information from Influence in Autocracy. This is the model this is the simple one-slide model of local autocracy, of centralized autocracy. So I wanted to argue for this. My APSR 2008 paper had a simple model in which I want to argue any leader needs a reputation for reliably rewarding loyal service. A leader can get more support when key supporters monitor how he treats the other supporters, so that and I'll call those key supporters courtiers. Courtiers are important people in a regime who hang around the prince, the court. They spend time at the court monitoring, gossiping about what's happening with other in the national leader's relationships with other important government officials, and when those key supporters are monitoring how he treats other people, so that if he ever didn't reward one appropriately, if he failed to report one appropriately, then everybody would distrust the leader, and the leader would then be in big trouble politically, be unable to defend his regime. My APSR 2008 paper gave a simple model in which if any leaders can organize such a court, then They can get lots of the people who will get lots of support when they contend for power, and challengers would be unable to recruit any supporters in that model if they don't also institute such constraints. So what I want to say is, if an autocratic ruler, what is an autocratic ruler? The simplest model is an autocratic ruler. If I'm the autocratic ruler of North America, that means I rule North America and I'm accountable to nobody. If I'm accountable to nobody, how can I make a promise to anybody? And so that's not the model. The model is an autocratic ruler is politically accountable to a small collection of high officials who I'll call the courtiers and nobody else. So of course he's accountable to somebody. The key members of his team, the highest members, his highest lieutenants are monitoring how other high lieutenants are being rewarded, and he has to maintain a reputation with them. Now the problem, because the ruler can profitably resell vacant offices, when the ruler appoints offices, these offices that have associated moral hazard rents are valuable, and the ruler can profitably resell them. The courtiers must be in the business of deterring wrongful dismissals. So one of the things that has to be going on in an autocratic regime is that the top guy, the boss, the king, is constantly tempted to get rid of some powerful underofficial and use that power, that position, that person's that powerful agent's local officials' valuable position as a reward to bribe support or costly political action or other personal services from somebody else to keep reselling the office. So, but why doesn't he do it? He doesn't do it because every time he fires somebody, the courtiers get nervous. So the courtier, one of the things that's going on, one thing we should understand about autocratic regimes is that the fundamental dynamic is every now and then somebody important is being fired, is being sacked, but the king has to justify it to the inner circle. Now, I'm going to assume in a centralized autocracy, so autocracy means the autocratic ruler is politically accountable only to his courtiers. And those courtiers, the local residents, the little peons who live in those remote towns, they can't communicate their views on officials' performance to the courtiers, to the circle of influential people in the capital. The autocrat, I'm going to assume, can privately poll residents' views, but he can't commit to use such information or to share it unselectively with his courtiers. He might share it only when he wants to he piles up all the bad reports in a stack, and when he wants to get rid of someone, he shows the bad reports to the courtiers. But why is he doing it? Also, of course, the ruler could induce people to give him bad reports. Let him know that he wants a bad report on a certain official today. So I want to say the courtiers can impose political costs on the ruler, but these costs can't depend on information that the ruler could manipulate, obviously, because he'll always do it to minimize. So here's the model. The model is going to be the ruler every year has some nu of j is the net service value that the ruler could get from replacing official j and putting somebody else in that unique position that official j holds, and we can assume that that's less than or equal to the value of the moral hazard of the budget that is the moral source of the moral hazard rents with office j. The courtiers can observe the set of all dismissed officials this year, and they kind of make trouble and they say, you're going to have to do some costly activity, dear ruler, in order to keep our trust, and that fee of D can depend on the set. Here's a set that actually I'm wrong, because it can work. Supposing the ruler, I'm going to assume that the nu of j are independent random variables, let's say with a support over some interval, and they're not observed by the courtiers because they depend on the things like how much does the ruler want to suggestion that J might become disloyal, or a new supporter's desire or suitability for J's office. If the nu were symmetric, if the value of replacing any official were the same as any other official, and if phi treated all the officials symmetrically, then the ruler would be willing to pick D based on his information about local public services. but would he prefer to dismiss those with the best services as potential rivals? Would he really want to dismiss the people who had the worst services, who provide the worst public services? Maybe he'd want to dismiss the people who have the best public services. So I'm going to assume that the new are independent of the public services, which is a way of saying that how the local residents feel doesn't, the local residents' pleasure or displeasure doesn't have any effect on the ruler. They're not important. The only people who are important are the courtiers. But selling those offices can be important because it brings in another important new member to court. So from the courtier's perspective, so I'm going to say they're not symmetric. And then if I simply say, if each new J has a positive density on some interval, and then the courtiers, no matter what fee function they choose, they cannot make the ruler indifferent. With probability 1, the ruler will have a unique D that doesn't depend on the G's, on the actual public spending. And therefore, the probability of the ruler being indifferent among 2 or more dismissal sets would be 0. Therefore, the ruler is going to choose to dismiss those people who give him the maximal value of reselling their specific offices and less the cost that the courtiers are imposing on the ruler. Neutrality, I should say, could also be subverted by influential courtiers. If the ruler were really indifferent between dismissing one guy or another, if we were to enlarge the model by saying that these various local officials are probably themselves clients of individual important courtiers who may propose them to the proteges of various important courtiers, and each courtier wants a reputation for being able to protect his people, then influential courtiers would want to raise slightly the ruler's cost of dismissing an official who had better connections with them as patrons. So that would be another reason why the following proposition can be defended. In a nation where the people of the communities who know whether the public spending has been done or not, have no independent channels for expressing political grievances, including the courtiers themselves can't set up their own separate reporting networks that are unregulated by not controlled by the central government, by the national ruler, then an autocrat who has unrestricted power to appoint and dismiss local officials cannot be credibly committed to hold them accountable for public services that are observable only by local residents, because he doesn't have any incentive to use his political concerns, the new of J concerns, are going to override anything else. But ex ante, if he can't keep them accountable, then they're not going to provide the public services, they'll steal the money, and ex ante, the residents aren't going to invest if good public services can't be guaranteed, and so the country is poor. The end. National democracy. Freedom of, if we have a centralized democracy, there's going to be freedom of speech. And one thing I've said, the people are unhappy in a town and the elite don't know it. Now they do if you have freedom of speech. So that's one. There are a couple of other things. National democratic rulers have even more reason not to want to have new entrants. In the paper, I discuss a kind of sequential bidding model that's kind of like Kramer's 1977 paper, where the incumbent spends money in every province, gets his agents to spend a certain amount of money in every province, and a challenger makes a commitment, a credible commitment to have his agents spend some other amount of money, and then there's an election. And what always happens is the challenger can always win by offering slightly more than the incumbent in most districts, and paying for it by offering 0 in one district where the incumbent spends the most. And this process is going to converge to one where the offers are going to be small everywhere. And Fairjohn in his 1986 paper has a similar thing at the very end of that agency paper. He considers multiple agents where you compete. Every district wants to compete to be the lowest. The central official is going to choose to build his political power on a majority of vote, but the majority vote is going to be from those who are willing to accept the least public services, and that converges to 0. So I said, okay, let's not do that model. That was using a continuum. So supposing I get away from the underbidding phenomenon by saying, you know what, let's restrict the government by saying it's a centralized democracy. There are going to be 2 candidates for president every year, every couple of years. But the public budgets in every province are legally fixed at capital G, but candidates can compete on whether they promise that the agents who spend the G, are they going to be accountable to the residents, or are they going to not be accountable? When a candidate doesn't promise local accountability of his appointed governors, then the candidate can, of course, sell the office for a campaign contribution. Now, how much would you pay me for a campaign well, if it's in a symmetric equilibrium where I have a 50% chance of being president, you should be willing to pay me 0.5 G for the rights to spend it. So now, so we just created a standard model in which campaign promises and campaign spending and campaign funds and appealing to voters are both important. So the way it does, alpha is the fraction of uninformed, impressionable voters who vote for candidates in proportion to their campaign spending, and 1 minus alpha are the informed guys who vote for the best local promise. Let's assume that they split equally between the two candidates if the candidates both promise accountability or both promise or neither, or both sell their district. So let Xi be the fraction of districts that. So I'm assuming that the candidate can make either a credible commitment to choose. He can make a credible commitment to provide good locally accountable government, or he can make a credible commitment to sell the province to the highest bidder. And let Xi be the fraction of districts where the candidate sells to the highest bidder. Then this is the difference between the ones that aren't sold by candidate 1 and candidate 2, and 1 minus alpha is the vote there. And then the sold ones, the impressionable voters are splitting in proportions that are proportional to the fraction of the donations raised. And you just figure out the maximum of that, and it turns out it's something. And for example, if 1/3 of the voters are impressionable, 2/3 are rational, then let's see, 1/3 over 2/3 is a half. So then 25% of the provinces are going to be sold to the highest bidder. And let me just say Ukraine. The possibility of such politically neglected regions should be considered extremely dangerous for a nation's territorial integrity. If there's any we're going to have 25% of the provinces, whoever wins, 25% of the provinces he's sold to the highest bidder, and people there are completely pissed. And if there's an outside option, that's very dangerous. And by the way, presidential elections in Ukraine look a lot like this, because actually the president's main power is the power to appoint governors. There's a prime minister who runs the national government. So at least, let me finish, I'm sorry. So I've analyzed a model with local public investments, which can be efficiently managed with local accountability. With local public services, when local public services can be observed by local residents, the officials can be held accountable only if their careers depend on the local residents' approval. Political decentralization means guaranteeing that the local residents have such power over their officials, power to ruin their careers. Now the question is this: what I then tried to talk about was that in a centralized autocratic regime, there's going to be moral hazard at the center. This could mean that if the local residents' power is not guaranteed, it's probably not even it's not going to be there. They're not going to be able to. The centralized leader can use a centralized leader can use local offices as rewards, but then dismissals jeopardize his vital reputation for rewarding service. In a centralized autocracy, the local residents can't communicate their complaints to the national elite, who must approve the ruler's decisions to dismiss responsible officials. So the autocratic national government can't make a credible commitment to sustain efficient local investments without some guarantee of local political rights. Without political decentralization, national politics is what determines the local official's career, not local public services, so they don't provide any local public services. Then when I talked about democracy, national leaders may still have strong political reasons to prefer, national political reasons may have strong political reasons to prefer political centralization, even when it harms economic development, because they don't like the competition from local rulers. That's true under democracy as well as from autocracy. In the unitary democratic state, the last model, where voters would, in a model of the unitary democratic state where voters would prefer a candidate who promises decentralized accountability. They prefer to have somebody who promises decentralized accountability. Still, competitively elected national leaders may choose to keep inefficient centralized control, at least over some local offices, to use so that as patronage rewards for contributors, so that we don't get full efficiency. And I want to argue, but federal democracy can become stable once it's applied, because elected governors and mayors become vital local power brokers in national coalition buildings. I think the most important thing about the United States is that the founding fathers had to accept substantial decentralization of power in the new nation, because autonomous local governments had been established a century earlier than the first national elections, and since then century before the writing of the national constitution. The Constitutional Convention, fortunately, occurred a century after more than a century after the creation of local governments throughout the territory, and I think that this model was meant to say that democratic local governments may have overseen local public investments, were an efficient vehicle for local public investments to build the richest nation on earth. Okay, stop there. Sorry. Okay. Yeah, please.
Sure. So in a model where you have courtiers, why wouldn't it be the case that the kind of grouped courtiers couldn't act as accountability, couldn't provide accountability in 17th, 18th century Britain? One of the justifications for the notion of collective responsibility was precisely this. So we could stop the ruler from having...
So the argument's fragile. The statement of Proposition 2 said without some independent channels. So if what could work, and maybe, for example, maybe this is what's going on, maybe this might be a secret of efficiency in the People's Republic of China, is that the courtiers, the guy at the very top who controls communication channels allows various other leading agents the ability to set up their own independent reporting networks to collect evidence of malfeasance by local officials. If the only person who can collect, so the argument was if the only person who can collect the information on local malfeasance in the capital is the guy who gets to resell the offices, it's not going to work. But if we have several different factions in our oligarchic autocratic government, and each one of them has its own network and has a way of providing that bringing evidence, which might then be credibly communicated in the circles of power, that's a more complicated political system, and it might work. You're absolutely right. So I was setting up a straw man and defining. I was putting up his little feet very, very narrowly and then knocking him down. So you're absolutely right. I think if what you're saying is, what about different members of the elite oligarchy collecting independent reports? That would work. And I think probably what happens in, the People's Republic of China is an institution which has created more economic growth for more humanity than by some objective measures than ever in history. It's not a centralized, it's not a multi-party democracy. So to me, I'd call it an autocracy, but in my political language. But it's not centralized. It has very strong decentralization of power. But also, we don't really know what's going on. I don't think even well-informed Chinese people who are outside of the party central committee don't. Most of us, of humanity, doesn't know what's going on, what the real rules of the game are. But if the real rules, it's well understood that there are factions in the party central committee of the People's Republic of China, and if those factions maintain separate autonomous communication networks that provide evidence, or the various party investigation committees are some dominated by one group, some dominated by another group, and they're reporting on each other. So that could be a method of getting the information there. Now the question is, do they then have the incentive to actually, I was using an informational argument, which is the simplest one. Once we get the information out, if we can get the information by independent reports, several of us all get reports that the governor who's your protege of that province in the south of the country has been stealing everything. We now know that. We feel it's established in the capital. Do we actually want to act on that? That's another question, but at least the information is available, yeah. My informational argument won't work. Now it's a more complicated model to assert feasibility, to create. Ultimately, I think, for a better model, I said it wasn't a good model, a better model to show that when the information can be credibly communicated, but the elite why would the elite choose to act on it? The main reason to choose to act on it would be a fear that if we allow our local officials to just steal everything, people are ultimately going to become less well-governed than they think they could be, and they'll rebel against us. I think that the fact that there was a near rebellion in China in 1989, I guess it was, Tiananmen Square, that has motivated the national has been very important in giving the national leadership in China a good incentives. And if it never happens again and ultimately is forgotten, that I suspect the way to win your way into, the way to build a coalition to become the #1 leader of China, when the people don't matter but only local party bosses matter, is to hold local party bosses to very lax standards, to get a reputation for holding local party bosses to the most forgiving of standards, and then we're out. Then we lose again. But that's not my model. That would be a better paper. I haven't written it yet. I'd like to write it, or we can write it. Yeah, please.
In the original model, so you're the mayor, and we're going to reappoint you if we got at least stay at a good outcomes. So, let's say me and Scott and Casey noticed that we all got bad outcomes. So now we share information, and we now have a serial that says that you really put in low effort. Why can't we come and extort you for the votes? Do we have? So the nature of our outcomes, is that observable by others?
That's a good question. The slide I skipped, actually, I said, here's this good, you're saying my good equilibrium might not work because they might collectively deviate. Well, said there's a Nash equilibrium, I didn't say Nash equilibrium, but in the paper I say, it is a Nash equilibrium, but it's a Nash equilibrium where people who are voting don't really care. They don't care about anything, so they might as well report honestly. So that's not very, I can get it. The top 5 lines there or something are about how to perturb the model to make one where there's a strict Nash equilibrium where you care. And the story there is that when the ruler budgets, there's some accident in various neighborhoods that maybe a little more, a little less is actually spent. And the ruler actually knows, not the ruler, the official knows whether he spent more, a little bit less in a neighborhood or not. And then when he counts the votes, he looks, and if people, and some of us are stupid, might be a sort of a stupid type that just randomly votes yes or no according to, say, the same marginal probability. But so whenever there's a mistake where he spends a little more or a little less, if we don't match, then he thinks that our neighborhood is a neighborhood where everyone's on autopilot. They're voting on autopilot. And then he says, screw it, now I don't want to spend in that neighborhood anymore. So that now we have local, a neighborhood reputation to maintain. Now that's a story. That's a story that gets it strict. Could you make a binding commitment somehow? Well, how do you do that? Reputation. We will never vote for you again unless you pay us this extra amount of money. Take some of our moral hazard. We're getting into cooperative game theory, I think now. Or you're enlarging the game in a big way that I don't understand. So the answer was, but let me say, part of your is if there's something else in local politics other than are we happy with his performance, the answer is local politics isn't as good as I claim it is, and I want to be. The paper says this is a model in which local politics can get it exactly right, and even with a strict equilibrium in this perturbed model, but don't let me fool you. Local politics sometimes is dysfunctional. There are bad equilibria of that game as well. Yeah. If other things besides performance matter, and they do, in running for mayor of Chicago, for example, people have other passions.
Right.
So,
this is the last question. So thank you very much, Rob.
Thank you. See you tomorrow morning.